I think almost everybody agrees that the ego is the problem. The Stoics want you to shrink your ego down, and the Buddhists want you to dissolve your ego, and the self help industry wants you to manage your ego, and the spiritual communities want you to transcend the ego. The online philosophers will want you to kill your ego, and they'll sell you a course on how you can actually do that. And then, somewhere in the middle of that entire consensus, almost nobody stops to ask what exactly is lost when the ego is gone, once it's killed. Now, the ego does have a reputation problem. I'll say that right now. And the reputation itself is not completely undeserved. An unchecked ego is genuinely a destructive thing. It distorts your perception, it manufactures grievance, and it turns every single interaction into a referendum on the self. Nobody is arguing for that version of the ego. I am not arguing for that version of the ego. The man who cannot hear criticism without hearing an attack, the woman who cannot be in a room without needing to be the most significant thing in it. These are real pathologies and they cause real damage. That is undeniable. But somewhere in between that unchecked ego, which causes suffering, and therefore eliminate the entire ego, something went pretty bad, because those two things are not the same argument, and treating them as if they are is not philosophy. What it is a sales pitch designed as wisdom. Friedrich Nietzsche, one of the most impactful writers of all time, understood something that most of his readers either missed or were just completely unwilling to follow. The self is not given. It is a project, and it is something you either build deliberately or allow to be built for you by circumstances, by other people's expectations, by the slow accumulation of whatever was the easiest thing for you to become. The ego, however, properly understood, is not the noise that interrupts the real you. What it is the structure through which a real you becomes possible at all. Without it, there is no position, there is no resistance, and there is no particular way of meeting the world that is yours, rather than a borrowed world. Without it, you are not enlightened, and you are simply available to others. Pleasantly, compliantly, spiritually, all of these are just justified words for being available to whoever needs you to be something for them at that moment. Now, this is what the ego death movement rarely names directly, that a person without a strong definition of themselves is not free. They are just easier to move around and shift to whatever your demands are for them. Now, Buddhism, treated honestly, does not actually ask you to become nothing. This is one of the most persistent misconceptions in Western spiritual consumption. That's a big sentence, oh my god. The doctrine of anatta, no fixed self, is not an instruction to hollow yourself out and call it peace. It is an observation to the nature of clinging on to things, about the suffering that comes from treating the self as a permanent, definite object rather than a living, changing process. The Buddhist critique is not of selfhood, it is of rigidity. It is of the self that cannot move because it is too busy protecting and defending its own edges. And there is an enormous difference between that of a self who holds loosely and that of a self who is not there at all. One of them can act, and one of them can choose and refuse and create and love without any sort of direction, and then die without having ever been someone particular. The other one is just the absence of friction, and the absence of friction is not the same thing as peace. Sometimes it's just the absence of everything that would have made you worth knowing. Now, here is the thing about ego dissolution as an aesthetic, as a TikTok trend. It is so easy to perform. It is so easy to virtue signal your ego as being gone. Easier in much ways than the actual work of building and then examining oneself. You adopt a vocabulary, things like presence, surrender, non-attachment, flow, and it reads immediately as depth or someone who's wise. And it signals that you move beyond the petty concerns of selfhood into something much more spacious and much more evolved. It is, in other words, an extremely effective identity to take upon. That is, again, undeniable. However, that is the one thing that it claims not to be. The man who has killed his ego and needs you to know about it has not killed his ego. It's the complete opposite. He has given it a costume, a spiritual disguise, and stopped questioning it as a whole. The woman who has dissolved the self through 10 years of meditation practice now holds it very loosely. She is a different matter entirely to the other person. The difference between them is not the vocabulary that they use. It is whether the dissolution cost them something real from their life, or whether it was just adopted precisely because it was cheaper than the alternative, simply because it was easier to present themselves to the world that way. Now, that alternative is just becoming someone. It's becoming someone specifically, someone with edges, with a point of view that not everybody will find comfortable, with desires that are actually yours and not just consensus desires or virtue signaling to make everything look personal to everyone else around you. It is someone with the willingness to be a particular kind of person in a world that would prefer if you remain general and blanket termed enough to become useful to the world. That ego is the only thing standing between you and nothing in particular. Not nothing in the Buddhist or nihilistic sense, not the luminous or open or non-grasping awareness that centuries of serious practice point towards, but nothing in just the ordinary sense. It doesn't all have to be super spectral. Nothing in the sense of a person who could be absolutely anyone, who could be anyone, anything once, or everyone once, who agrees more than they disagree, and who has smoothed themselves into a shape that creates absolutely no friction when trying to fit in with every single social standing, and therefore leaves no mark. That version of nothing is everywhere. It is the dominant mode that most people take upon themselves nowadays, and it wears a lot of different costumes or disguises. Some of them are explicitly spiritual, and some of them just socially fluent. Some of them are so habituated that the person inside them no longer remembers that there was actually a person inside them or ever actually anything else upon themselves. The ego, at its best, is the refusal of that. It is the structure that says, I have a particular way of seeing something. It is a particular set of things that I will not do, a particular set of habits that it entails, a particular hunger that is mine and mine alone and not derived from anything else. It is a specific quality of presence that if you completely removed it, it would leave a specific absence on that person rather than a general smoothness. That is not pathology, that is not philosophy, that is not existentialism, that is just personhood, that is just being human. Now, this is the uncomfortable part with it, because the question that this raises is not whether the ego matters or doesn't matter at all. The question is which version of yourself has been living inside of yours. Now, there are two ways to have a strong ego. One of them is the version that Nietzsche warned us about failing to achieve. It is a self that was built, examined, stress tested, and one that has survived contact with its own contradictions and emerged with a clearer sense of what it actually is. The other is the version that everybody recognizes but fewer admit to actually being. It is a self that was never really interrogated, and one that mistakes its preferences for principles, one that mistakes its habits for its identity and its defenses for values. The first one knows what it is and why it is what it is. I can't speak. The second one just insists upon itself. And the reason that this is uncomfortable for most people is that most people consume so much content about ego death and are not actually doing so because they have too much of the first kind. They are simply doing so because they have too much of the second kind, and dissolution feels like the easier solution for them to get rid of it. Easier than the long and the unglamorous work of actually imagining what is there, what is within that ego. It is easier than finding out which parts of your identity were chosen and which parts of your identity were just inherited and never actually questioned. It is easier than the specific discomfort of becoming more yourself rather than less. Killing the ego is not always cowardice, it's not always a bad thing, but it is always worth asking whether, in your particular case, it may be a good thing. Nietzsche's Zarathustra descends from the mountains not to dissolve into the world, but simply to meet it as something fully formed to the world. The encounter requires a self sturdy enough to withstand contact without any sort of collapse. It doesn't have to be rigid, because rigidity is brittleness dressed as strength, but instead it has to be rooted into the ground. It has to be particular. It has to be capable of saying, this is what I am, and having that mean something instead of just having it virtue signal to the world that it means something. The Buddhist monk who has genuinely loosened his grip on selfhood and humanism after decades of practice is not any less present in the room than the monk who hasn't. He is more present, as a matter of fact, in my opinion, because he is not spending any of himself on defense of the ego. The self is still completely there. It is just not frightened of having its own edges. That is not an ego death. That is ego maturity at its finest. And the path to it runs directly through having a self worth examining in the first place. You cannot dissolve something that you never built. You can only pretend to dissolve it. The question that the ego death movement never asks of anyone, and the question worth sitting with for a while after this video is ended and actually journaling about it, is quite a simple one. When you imagine a version of yourself with less ego, maybe quieter, maybe less reactive, maybe more at peace or less insistent upon itself, are you imagining someone more fully themselves? Or are you imagining someone easier to be around? Because those two things are not the same thing at all. That is the biggest mistake that people make with this ego death. And the fact that you are not immediately sure, that you cannot answer that question in your mind, you're not immediately certain of which one you are imagining, that uncertainty, that confusion right there is probably the most honest thing this video can leave you with. The ego was never the enemy itself, but it has always been the mirror reflecting the person who resides within it. And some people would genuinely much rather dissolve and kill their ego than simply look into that mirror.